In the quarantine zone were the Gagarin and the Kimhoffs. It doesn't sound like it's written. Kimhoffs. Those were the first two ships, both on your ID sheet. And they were heading close and were just a few miles from the quarantine zone. Now that was fine and dandy until it was then reported that a Soviet submarine moved right in the middle of both ships. So here's one ship here, here's one ship here, Gagarin, Kimhoffs, and all of a sudden now you've got a submarine in here that's gone right in the middle of it. What's that submarine doing there? No, it's protecting those two ships that probably are carrying missiles. So now they've got a bigger problem. They don't just have the Gagarin and the Kimhoffs heading for the quarantine line. They also have a Soviet submarine which had moved into position between the two ships to protect the freighters. Because they know what's going on here, right? They know what they're getting into. Now, we didn't know at the time, but it was later revealed that that submarine held 20 torpedoes, including one nuclear torpedo, on its arsenal while it was there. Now, we didn't know that at the time, but we later found out after this crisis ended that that submarine actually carried 20 regular torpedoes and one nuclear torpedo. Now, what do you think we have right at the quarantine line? What do we have there? We have a battleship called the USS John R. Pierce. The battleship USS John R. Pierce is sitting in still water, so to speak, right at the quarantine line. That's the ship that's standing guard to make sure that no Soviet ships cross that quarantine line. And that ship, the USS John R. Pierce, is just sitting there waiting. And they're ready to do what? Enforce the rules of engagement if necessary. So as these two Soviet ships now with a submarine escorting them towards the quarantine line, as they approach, the USS John R. Pierce stands ready to assert the rules of engagement if necessary. Now, why is that submarine a problem other than the fact it's protecting those two Soviet ships? What becomes very vulnerable to a submarine when it's in the water? What's Kennedy concerned about? The Pierce. The Pierce is in a very vulnerable position. And so because of this, Kennedy ordered the captain of the Pierce to force the submarine to the surface, because he didn't want that submarine taking out the Pierce and then running the blockade. So once they find out that submarine is escorting those two freighters, Kennedy realizes that that Soviet submarine is a serious threat and that the Pierce is in a very vulnerable position. So as a result, Kennedy orders the captain of the Pierce to force the submarine to the surface. Now, if he does that, what's going to happen? How's he going to force the sub to the surface? Yeah, we're going to have an engagement, aren't we? What's an engagement going to lead to? Could lead to war. But Kennedy has no choice. He cannot leave the Pierce vulnerable to that submarine. So Kennedy orders the captain of the Pierce to force the submarine to the surface. At 10:25 a.m., as those two ships get to the quarantine line, and we're getting ready to force the submarine to the surface and possibly shoot out rudders in the other two ships, CIA Director McCone, who is also involved in this, reported back to XCOM that the two ships had stopped short of the line and were turning around. Why is that a problem?
We'll never get to see what's on them.
No, because what has Kennedy done prior to them turning around, which we want him to do? He's ordered that the Pierce to make that sub come to the surface. And to do that, they're going to have to fire, and that's going to really be a problem because we got him doing what we want him to do. So as soon as Kennedy hears McCone's announcement, he quickly orders the Pierce to, quote, belay that order. And just luckily, he got him to do that before they fired, or we might have been in a different mess. So he orders the sub to be brought to the surface because it looks like these ships are going to cross the line, and he can't even wait to see if they do cross the line because he's got the Pierce in such a vulnerable position with that submarine. And he orders it to be brought to the surface, and as soon about the same time he orders that, they start to turn, and so he's able to belay the order just before they shoot. Yeah.
What happened to the radio contact? Weren't they supposed to make
They
before?
they did, and you'll see that. They kept coming. I should have mentioned they did. They followed all that. And they just kept it coming, and then they found out the submarine was underneath. Now, when it was verified that the Soviet ships stopped short, a relieved Secretary of State Dean Russ stated, quote, "We were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." And his point was, you ever been in a stare-off like this and see who blinks first? Or a chicken race where you got coming at each other, we're going to see which one pulls off first? That's kind of what he was mentioned. It's kind of what he mentioned. We were eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked. In other words, the old staring contest, you used to have somebody and you'd sit there like that and see who blinked first. That's kind of how it felt. And the pressure was mounting because we were about to get ourselves in a nuclear war. Now, what do we have still coming? We have 23 more ships coming. And shortly after the Gagarin and Kimhoffs turned around, CIA Director McCone then reported back to the Situation Room in the White House that 20 Soviet ships had either stopped short of the quarantine zone or turned around. 20 more had either stopped short or turned around before they got there. So, CIA Director McCone reports that 20 Soviet ships either stopped short of the quarantine zone or turned around. So how many have we left unaccounted for? Actually, we think 3, but actually there were 6 because we had miscounted the report of 25. Actually it was 28. So there's still 6 ships coming. So we've got 22 ships that have either stopped short and stayed dead in the water, short of the quarantine zone, or turned around. But we still have 6 Soviet freighters that are continuing. So it wasn't 25, we ended up finding out it was 28. Well, XCOM discussed on what they should do with the 6 ships that were still coming. And this is what Secretary of Defense McNamara stated. He stated 4 things of importance. So at this time, where's Secretary of State McNamara? Pentagon. And now they're discussing on the telephone, back and forth, the radio, what they should do. I say state, yeah, he was defense. So, anyway, here's what McNamara told XCOM from the Pentagon. 1, 4 of those 6 ships were still a day away from the quarantine line. Which meant what? They had plenty of time to still turn around. So 4 of the 6 that were still coming were a day away. And his point was, he was quite confident they would turn around before they got there. How would they do that? Why weren't they turning around now? Because McNamara felt that the commanders of those 6 ships had not gotten their orders yet from the Soviet Union to turn around. So, but because they're still a long ways away. And his explanation to the president, what are we going to do about these 6 ships that are still coming? Well, 4 of the 6 are still, a long ways out. They're more than a day away, and I'll bet you that their commanders haven't got the word to turn around yet. Now, the ships that the United States suspected of carrying weapons out had already stopped or turned around. Okay, the ones we were concerned about. So what did McNamara think maybe the other 2 were that were still coming, that were closer? Maybe they were what? Legitimate ships that were carrying supplies. And this is what McNamara said. He said, 4 of the 6 ships are still a day away, and I believe that the commanders of those ships just haven't been given their orders yet to turn around. And those ships that we suspected of carrying missiles have already either stopped or turned around. And then he said, let's let the other 2 go through because, quote, we sure would look bad firing upon a ship full of baby food. Okay, remember, Gromyko said all they were doing was trying to feed the children of Cuba? And he just made that statement. We'd let the other 2 ships go. We'd sure look bad shooting up a ship full of baby food. Which, would they look bad if they shot down a ship that didn't have offensive weapons? So they didn't believe there were any offensive weapons on those other 2. Well, the one that they were concerned about was the Bucharest. It was an oil tanker and it continued towards Cuba. And an oil tanker probably would not have agricultural supplies on it. It was one of the two left. And they discussed that and they let it go through. And guess who was mad about that? Who's mad that XCOM let the Bucharest go through, the oil tanker? The military. Because they didn't follow their plan. They weren't pleased with President Kennedy's decision, went against their recommendation. They said, no, you can't let him go through. Well, we're going to let him go through. They did go through and went to Cuba, and they were found later on not to be carrying any offensive weapons. So if we'd have shot down, used the rule of engagements on the Bucharest, we'd have been looking pretty bad. And that's another great decision Kennedy made with XCOM's blessing, is they let the Bucharest go through. It was an oil tanker, and it was not carrying anything. Hey, what's happening?
Hey.
Hey, go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you using this room after school?
There's a lot of academics in here.
That's what I was hoping to learn something without in this room.
Yeah, you can use it. Yeah, you're good.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I give them a little tour of it so they get prepared for school.
Okay.
All right. So anyway, so the quarantine action proved effective, right? They listened to us. Well, once those ships stopped short of the quarantine zone, Kennedy initiated 2 more demands upon the Soviet Union. Okay? So he kind of felt like he had control of the situation. So after those ships turned around, Kennedy initiated 2 more demands upon the Soviet Union. What does he want out of it? What are the 2 things Kennedy wants the Soviet Union to do? Something that the quarantine, we talked about, the quarantine stopped any more from getting in, right? He wanted 2 things. He initiated these 2 demands. Get the missiles out of Cuba and dismantle what? The missile launching pads. So after we got them stopped, and Kennedy was successful in that endeavor, he still had a problem with the missiles in Cuba and the missile construction sites, which were actually getting closer to operational. So once the Soviet ships turned around, Kennedy initiated 2 more demands to Khrushchev. 1, that the missiles in Cuba needed to be removed immediately, and 2, the missile construction sites must be dismantled immediately. And tension mounted now because we weren't real sure how that would go over. Okay, well, Khrushchev replies to Kennedy. I just want you to listen to this and then we'll be done for the day. This is Khrushchev's response to Kennedy after getting those 2 demands. He said, quote, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. You are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us." That was the response Kennedy got from Khrushchev. Okay, so this is going to be not over yet. And tomorrow we'll talk about another unfortunate thing that happened that irritated Kennedy really, really quite badly. Okay? Very good. Nice job today. So, part of the problem solved. We've got a long ways to go.